He acted violently to escape death, until the Count learned the truth. Kalen Vance, a high-born son of Fallen House, is forced into a life of desperate brutality after witnessing the High Inquisitor execute his family for a treason they never committed. To vanish from the Inquisitor's reach, he assumes the identity of a mute, volatile stable hand at the estate of Count Alaric Thorne, a man known as the King's Bloodhound. For 3 years, Kalen has feigned a savage, wordless rage to keep people at a distance, using violence as a deterrent to hide his refined education and true identity. However, the Count, a master of seeing through masks, becomes obsessed with a feral boy in his stables. When the Inquisitor arrives at Thorn Hall to flush out the last witness, Kalen must decide if dropping his violent ruse will lead to the gallows or finally bring justice to his family. Before we deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you, and I don't want you to miss it anything. Now, let's get into the story. The world believed that a nobleman's strength was his sword and his finest asset was a commanding voice. For Kalen, his voice was a curse. It was the mark of the elite that would draw the monster to his throat. He stood in the hay-strewn dark of the stables. His knuckles were split and bleeding, raw from a fight he had started just to be left alone. The air was gray. The straw was damp. The very atmosphere of the stables at Thorn Hall tasted of horse sweat, rusted iron, and the sharp tang of manure. He had not spoken a word in 3 years. And in those 3 years, for the first time in his life, he was safe. The violence was a shield. It was an armor he had forged in the blood and fire of his last terrible night 3 years ago. He had been Lord Kalen, the pride of a high house, educated in strategy and law. He had lived in a world of marble and poetry. But the cage had been thrown open to the wolves. His father was dead, branded a traitor, and their legacy was ash. The memory was a physical, choking thing. It came at night. The High Inquisitor, Silas Vane, standing in his father's study, his boots on the priceless mahogany desk. He had been laughing. "It's your voice," Vane had hissed, his eyes cold as flint. "So refined. You speak as if you are the king himself." That night, Kalen hadn't waited to be caught. He had run past the stunned guards, out into black, freezing rain. He had run until his lungs burned and his fine boots were destroyed. He had sold the one thing of value he wore, his family signet, for a ticket to the edge of the world. He had found his way here, to the dirt, where men spoke with their fists. The stable master had asked his name. Kalen had just stared, his throat closing, the terror of that study swallowing him. He had lashed out, striking a wall until his hands bled. The master sighed, another broken brute. He was given a burlap tunic, a pile of straw, and left alone. Without his voice, without his title, his noble features seemed to fade into the grime. His violence made him invisible to those who looked for a gentleman. It was the only power he had ever known. He would never speak again. Then the carriage with the obsidian crest arrived. Count Alaric Thorne, the King's Bloodhound, was inspecting the estate staff. The men were lined up in the mud of the courtyard. Alaric walked with the grace of a wolf, his eyes missing nothing. He did not want a sycophant. He wanted a groom who was quiet. His gaze landed on Kalen. Kalen did not bow. He did not flinch. He simply met the Count's gaze, his jaw tight, his silence a wall of stone. Alaric tilted his head, his sharp eyes seeing the fine line of a jaw beneath the dirt and the ghost of an education in Kalen's eyes. "You," the Count said, his voice cutting through the wind. "What is your name?" Kalen gave a small, defiant shake of his head. "He doesn't speak, my lord," the master supplied. "A savage, we think, mute and prone to fits of rage, but he works like a demon." "Savage," Alaric repeated, a flicker of interest in his eyes. He stepped closer, invading Kalen's space. Kalen did not back away. He held his ground. "Perfect. I require a man who doesn't chatter. Have him moved to my personal stables. The carriage leaves in an hour." Kalen's blood ran cold. He was being sent to another cage, and this time, the man holding the key was the only one who could smell the truth on him. The world believed that a nobleman's strength was found in the clarity of his command and the sharpness of his wit. For Kalen, his voice was a curse, a neon sign pointing toward a gallows. He had buried Lord Kalen Vance beneath layers of grime and a reputation for mindless, animalistic rage. In the 3 years since the High Inquisitor had painted his family's blood across the marble of their estate, Kalen had not spoken a single word. He had traded his poetry for a snarl and philosophy for a well-timed elbow to a bully's ribs. Silence was his shield, but his violence was the spikes that kept everyone from looking too closely at the man behind the mask. The morning air in the stables was a thick soup of dust and animal heat, tasting of horse sweat and rusted iron. Kalen stood knee-deep in soiled straw, his breath blooming in the frigid air like ghostly wood smoke. He clutched a rusted pitchfork, his knuckles split and weeping from a disagreement he'd instigated earlier that morning just to ensure the other grooms kept their distance. To them, he was a broken brute, a savage who had forgotten the language of men. He preferred it that way. If they feared him, they wouldn't notice the way he studied the tactical maps Alaric's messengers sometimes dropped, or how he could identify a royal seal from 50 paces. The rhythmic thrum of the estate shifted as a carriage bearing an obsidian crest, the mark of the king's bloodhound, rolled into the courtyard. Count Alaric Thorne stepped out, a man who seemed carved from the very frost that clung to the north's jagged peaks. He was here for his inspection, his sapphire eyes scanning the line of servants with precision that felt like a blade tracing a vein. Alaric walked the line, his boots clicking with a predatory rhythm. He passed the trembling housemaids and the bowing footmen, without a word. Then he stopped. He stood before Kalen. Kalen did not bow. He did not avert his eyes. He stood with his jaw tight, his bloodied knuckles on display, meeting the Count's gaze with silent, simmering hostility. It was a dare, a silent invitation for the Count to dismiss him as a lost cause. This one, Alaric said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate in Kalen's very bones. The one, they say, speaks only with his fists. The Count stepped closer, invading Kalen's space until they were inches apart. He reached out, his gloved hand catching Kalen's chin, forcing him to hold the eye contact. Alaric wasn't looking at the dirt on his face or the burlap of his tunic. He was looking at the way Kalen's pupils didn't dilate in fear. He was looking at the aristocratic line of a jaw that no amount of grime could fully hide, and the defiance that belonged to a throne, not a stable. "I find quiet men useful," Alaric whispered, a thin, satisfied smile touching his lips. "And I find violent men fascinating. Pack your straw, savage. You're coming to my personal stables." "I find quiet men useful," Alaric whispered, a thin, satisfied smile touching his lips. "And I find violent men fascinating. Pack your straw, savage. You're coming to my personal stables." Kalen felt a cold jolt of terror. He had built a fortress of rage to stay hidden, but the bloodhound hadn't just found the door. He'd walked right through it. The transition from the communal filth of the main stables to the Count's private yard was not the liberation the other grooms imagined. For Kalen, it was a tightening of the noose. The private stables were quieter, cleaner, and far more exposed, a stage where every movement was a potential confession. Here, the horses were high-strung chargers worth more than a village, and the man who owned them had eyes like whetted steel. To survive the morning, Kalen knew he had to draw blood. The weight of his mask, the feral boy, depended entirely on perception of his mindless instability. He couldn't afford to be seen as a thoughtful servant. He had to be a hazard. As he hauled a heavy bucket of grain toward the stall of Alaric's black stallion, he purposely stepped into the path of Harlan, the lead groom. Harlan was a mountain of a man with a cruel streak, and a low opinion of anyone who couldn't bark back at him. "Watch where you're going, you silent freak," Harlan growled, shoving Kalen's shoulder with enough force to slop the grain onto the stone floor. Kalen didn't scream. He didn't curse. He simply let the bucket drop with a hollow clang. Slowly, he straightened his spine, letting his shoulders roll forward in a predatory hunch. He didn't look like a lord. He looked like an animal deciding where to bite. With a guttural snarl that stayed trapped in his chest, Kalen lunged. It was a calculated brawl. He used his elbows and head, fighting with the messy, undisciplined desperation of a man who had never been taught to duel. He let Harlan land a heavy blow to his cheek, relishing the metallic taste of blood that filled his mouth. It was a small price to pay for the theater. Kalen tackled the larger man into the hay, pinning him with ferocity that made the nearby horses whinny in alarm. He raised a fist, eyes wide and mad, ready to strike. Enough! The word was a whip crack. Alaric Thorne stood at the entrance of the stables, his silhouette framed by the harsh morning sun. He didn't look shocked. He looked bored, though his gaze lingered on the way Kaelin's hands were trembling. Not with fear, but with the adrenaline of a man who was far too good at controlling his impulses. Kaelin shoved himself off Harlan, spitting a glob of blood into the straw. He wiped his mouth with the back of a bruised hand and slunk back into the shadows of the stallion's stall, his head low, his breath coming in ragged, animalistic huffs. "He's a menace, my lord," Harlan panted, scrambling to his feet. "Nearly took my eye out for nothing." "He is exactly what I paid for," Alaric replied, his voice chillingly calm. He walked past the lead groom, his boots clicking toward Kaelin's corner. He stopped just outside the stall, peering through the wooden slats at the boy who sat in the dirt, staring at nothing. "The mask is heavy, isn't it?" Alaric whispered, too low for Harlan to hear. "To fight like a dog when you were clearly born to lead the pack. Clean yourself up, Kaelin. I have a war horse that needs a gentleman's touch, even if that gentleman is currently pretending to be a beast." Kaelin squeezed his eyes shut. The fight had reinforced his reputation with the staff, but it had done something far more dangerous. It had confirmed Alaric's theory. The Count wasn't looking for a groom. He was looking for the man beneath the monster. The following evening, a freezing rain lashed against the stone walls of Thorn Hall, turning the courtyard into a mire of gray slush. Kaelin had been summoned to the Count's inner sanctum under the guise of hauling fresh timber for the hearth. The weight of the oak logs across his shoulders was a welcome physical strain, a grounding force against the mounting dread that Alaric was closing in on his secret. He entered the study with a heavy, rhythmic stomp, maintaining the clumsy gait of a common laborer. The room was a sanctuary of wealth. The smell of old leather, expensive brandy, and the metallic tang of the Count's armor. Alaric was standing by a tall, cracked mirror near the window, his back to the door, staring out at the storm. On the center of the massive oak desk, seemingly forgotten, lay a sprawling parchment. Kaelin's breath caught. It wasn't just a map. It was a tactical layout of the capital's northern defenses, marked with the crimson ink of the High Inquisitor's personal seal. As he knelt to stack the wood, his eyes involuntarily swept the lines. His father had taught him to read terrain like a poet reads verse. He saw it instantly, a glaring flaw in the supply lines near the Black Gate, a bottleneck that would lead to a slaughter if the Inquisitor moved his troops as indicated. The firelight flickered, and for a split second, Kaelin's face lost its savage slackness. His brow furrowed, his eyes sharpening with the cold, analytical brilliance of a Vance Lord. He shifted his weight, his fingers twitching toward the charcoal pencil sitting on the desk's edge. He wanted to fix it. He wanted to scream at the stupidity of the maneuver. "The bottleneck is at the ravine, isn't it?" Alaric's voice was a soft blade, cutting through the crackle of the fire. Kaelin froze, instantly sagging his shoulders and letting his jaw hang slightly. He returned to the woodpile, fumbling with a log to mimic a simpleton's distraction. But Alaric had already turned. He didn't look at the fire. He looked at the cracked mirror. In its jagged reflection, he had seen Kaelin's eyes. He had seen the precise moment the feral boy had dissected a military strategy that would baffle a seasoned colonel. "Don't bother hiding it now," Alaric said, stepping away from the glass. He walked toward the desk, his shadow stretching over Kaelin like a shroud. "I watched you. You can just see shapes on a page. You saw the death of 5,000 men. You looked at that map and your pulse didn't quicken with fear. It quickened with frustration." Alaric leaned down, his face inches from Kaelin's. A groom doesn't know the difference between a pincer movement and a supply train, but a man who grew up in a war room does. He reached out, his fingers brushing the charcoal pencil toward Kaelin. "Go ahead. Mark the correction you were just making in your head. Show me the man who knows more than the king's own generals." Kaelin remained silent, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He stared at the charcoal, then up at the Count. The mask was cracking, the glass of his ruse shattered just like the mirror on the wall. He had been a beast for so long he had almost forgotten he was a man, but the bloodhound had a way of making him remember. The following morning, The air in the private stables was thick with the scent of damp oats and the low, rhythmic thrum of horses shifting in their stalls. Alaric had left Kalen to tend to Obsidian, a stallion as temperamental and dangerous as the Count himself. Kalen worked with mechanical, brooding intensity, his movements intentionally rough to maintain the illusion of the savage. But Alaric was playing a deeper game. On a small wooden stool near the stallion's water trough, the Count had left a heavy, cream-colored scroll. It was pinned open by a brass compass, its edges curling in the humidity of the stable. It was a logistical draft for the upcoming winter maneuvers, a document that had no business being in a stable, unless it was a baited hook. Kalen tried to ignore it. He brushed the stallion's flank with ferocity that made the beast snort, but his eyes kept darting to the parchment. From 10 feet away, he could see the flaw. The master of the king's logistics had planned a heavy cavalry charge through the lowlands, completely ignoring the fact that the seasonal thaw turned the soil into a bottomless mire. It wasn't just a tactical error. It was a death sentence for the horses. He looked around. The yard was empty. The Count was nowhere to be seen. Kalen's internal battle raged. He was a lord who had been raised to value the life of a warhorse above his own comfort. The thought of those animals drowning in the mud for the sake of a bureaucrat's ignorance made his blood boil. He dropped the brush, his feet moving of their own accord toward the stool. He didn't speak, but his mind roared with a correction. His hand, callous and stained with stable grime, reached out. He picked up the charcoal stick Alaric had accidentally left beside the compass. With a few swift, elegant strokes, the handwriting of a man who had spent years at a tutor's desk, he scratched out the lowland route and sketched a narrow, rocky bypass through the foothills. It was a scholar's slip, a moment with a man he was supposed to be dead, and buried rose to the surface. The foothills are treacherous for supply wagons, but they keep the horses' legs dry. Alaric's voice came from the loft above, soft and devastating. Kalen froze, the charcoal snapping between his fingers. He didn't turn around. He stayed hunched over the scroll, the damning evidence of his literacy and strategic brilliance laid bare beneath his hand. Alaric dropped down from the loft with a quiet thud, landing a few paces away. He didn't approach with a sword or shackles. He simply walked to the stool and looked at the map. He traced Kalen's charcoal lines with gloved finger, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. A groom who draws like an artist and thinks like a general, Alaric mused, his sapphire eyes locking onto Kalen's profile. You just saved 3 regiments and 1,000 horses, Kalen, but you also just killed the mute stable boy. Tell me, does a High Inquisitor know his traitor understands the terrain better than his own commanders? Kalen finally turned, his jaw tight, his eyes no longer blank and feral, but burning with a cold, noble fury. The silence remained, but the mask was in pieces at his feet. The sky over Thorn Hall turned the color of a bruised plum as a carriage bearing the obsidian seal of the crown rattled into the courtyard. Kalen stood in the shadows of the stable eaves, his breath hitching as the door opened to reveal a man wrapped in furs the color of dry blood. It was him. The High Inquisitor, Silas Vane, had not changed in 3 years. He still carried that same air of sanctimonious cruelty, his eyes scanning the state as if looking for a stray thread to pull until the whole world unraveled. Alaric stood on the stone steps, his expression a mask of bored aristocracy. "The North is a cold place for a hunt, Silas," he remarked, his voice smooth as silk over a blade. "The scent is fresh, Alaric," Vane replied, his voice a dry rasp that sent a jolt of ice through Kalen's veins. "The Vance boy is here. Somewhere. He carries a secret that belongs to the king, and I am not a man known for his patience." Kalen's knuckles whitened as he gripped a leather lead rope. His vision blurred with sudden, violent red. Every instinct screamed at him to belong, to wrap the rope around Vane's throat and squeeze until the light left those pale, treacherous eyes. He felt the phantom heat of his family's burning manor on his skin. But a heavy hand landed on his shoulder, grounding him. It was Alaric's lead guard, but the command had come from the Count's sharp, warning glance. "You!" Vane barked, his gaze swinging toward the stables. He pointed a gloved finger directly at Kalen. "Groom, bring my horses to the forge. They've thrown a shoe on your wretched roads." Kalen stepped forward, his head bowed low to hide the murderous fire in his eyes. He moved with a deliberate, animalistic slouch, dragging his feet to reinforce the image of the simpleton. As he took the reins of Vane's mount, the Inquisitor leaned in, the scent of expensive tobacco and old parchment clinging to him. Vane stared at the back of Kaelin's neck, his eyes narrowing. "A quiet house you keep, Alaric," Vane mused, his hand brushing against the hilt of his sword. "This one, he has a peculiar stillness about him. Does he speak?" "He is a mute, Silas. A broken thing from a village," Alaric intercepted, his tone dismissive, though his eyes never left the Inquisitor's face. "He is of no use to a man who hunts with his ears." Vane lingered for a heart-stopping moment, his suspicion a palpable heat. Kaelin kept his jaw locked so tight he feared his teeth might shatter. He was a ghost serving his executioner, a powder keg waiting for a spark. He led the horses away, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The hunt was no longer at the gates. It was sitting at the table, and Kaelin was the one holding the reins. The shadows in the stable loft were long and jagged, smelling of dust and the heavy, sweet scent of dry alfalfa. Kaelin lay flat against the floorboards, his body pressed into the darkness as the muffled voices below rose with the clarity of a death knell. Below him, two of the Inquisitor's personal guards stood near the forge, their polished breastplates gleaming in the amber light of the dying embers. "The Inquisitor is tired of Alaric's insolence," one of the men growled, his voice low but sharp. "The Count plays the loyal bloodhound, but he's been sniffing around the Vance archives too closely. He's looking for the same scroll we are." Kaelin's fingers dug into the wood until a splinter sliced into his palm. He didn't flinch. "We don't need to find the boy to win," the second soldier replied, a cruel chuckle vibrating in his throat. "We just need to plant the evidence that he's already here. Vane has a forged letter, penned in the Count's own hand, requesting safe passage for a mute servant of noble bearing to the coast. Once that's found in Alaric's destinite, the king will have the Count's head for treason before the sun sets tomorrow." Kaelin's blood turned to ice. It was the same tactic Vane had used on his father, a web of lies so perfectly woven that the truth became irrelevant. Alaric was a man of cold logic and sharp edges, but it shielded Kaelin, however cryptically. Now, that protection had made him a target. "And the groom?" the first soldier asked. "The mute. Vane wants him dealt with during the raid. If it's the Vance boy, he dies in the struggle. If it's just a peasant, well, a dead simpleton tells no tales." The guards move away, their spurs clinking rhythmically against the stone floor. Kaelin stayed frozen in the straw, his mind racing with the tactical speed Alaric had uncovered. He had spent 3 years perfecting the art of being nothing, of staying hidden to ensure his own survival. If he fled now into the blackness of the moors, he could disappear before the first torch was lit. Yet, as he looked toward the manor silhouette against the moonlight, he felt the crushing weight of a debt. Alaric Thorne had seen the man behind the beast and hadn't called for the guards. To flee was to survive, but it was also become an accomplice to the same shadow that had destroyed his family. The rage that had been his shield now shifted, sharpening into a different kind of weapon. He couldn't just be a witness anymore. He had to be the one to break the forge seal before it broke the Count. The storm outside finally broke, leaving Thornhall encased in a silence so thick it felt physical. Kaelin entered the Count's study with a tray of tea, his movements practiced and robotic, but his mind was a storm of its own. He had come to warn Alaric about the Inquisitor's forged letter, yet the words remained a heavy, unspoken mass in his throat. Alaric was not at his desk. He stood by the hearth, staring into the dying embers. As Kaelin set the tray down, the Count turned, his face illuminated by a flicker of orange light. He didn't speak. Instead, he reached into his waistcoat and pulled out a small, heavy object with a flick of his wrist. He tossed it onto the tea tray. It rolled across the silver with a hollow, metallic ring, coming to a stop against the base of the teapot. Kaelin's heart stopped. It was a signet ring, the gold tarnished with the crest unmistakable, a soaring falcon clutching a broken spear. The Vance family crest. "I found it in the possession of a pawnshop owner in the village," Alaric said, his voice a low, level hum. "He said a wild-eyed boy traded it for a carriage ticket 3 years ago. A boy who didn't speak a word, but whose eyes looked as though they had seen the end of the world." Kaelin stared at the ring, The air in the room suddenly too thin to breathe. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they hovered over the gold. The savage was gone. In his place stood a man whose heritage was a death sentence. The Inquisitor is searching the ground for a ghost, Kalen. Alaric continued, stepping closer until he was a looming shadow over the boy. He thinks he's hunting a witness. I think he's hunting the rightful heir to the Northern Duchy. I am the king's bloodhound, and by law, I should put you in irons this very second. He reached out, his hand moving not for a sword, but for Kalen's shoulder. His grip was firm, grounded in a strange, unspoken respect. But I have seen the way you look at his maps. I have seen the way you protect my horses. And I have seen the forged letter Vane's men have prepared to destroy me. He isn't just coming for you anymore. Alaric's sapphire eyes locked onto Kalen's with a piercing intensity that demanded the one thing Kalen had sworn never to give. I have shown you mercy by keeping your secret. Now you must show me the truth. You have been a beast for 3 years to survive, but a beast cannot stop an Inquisitor. Only a lord can do that. Tell me, Kalen Vance, was your father a traitor, or was he a sacrifice? The silence in the room stretched, taut as a bowstring. Kalen looked from the ring to the man who held his life in his hands. His throat ached, the vow of iron finally beginning to rust. He realized Alaric wasn't just asking for a story. He was offering a sword. The moon was a sliver of bone behind the scudding clouds as Kalen scaled the ivy-choked stone of the manor's north wing. He moved with a terrifying, fluid grace, no longer the clumsy brute of stables, but shadow reclaimed. The years spent hauling timber and wrestling stallions had hardened his frame into a weapon of lean muscle. To anyone watching from below, he was a feral phantom. To the man inside, he was the ghost of a past that refused to stay buried. He reached the narrow ledge of the Inquisitor's guest chambers, his fingers digging into the mortar with predatory strength. Through the leaded glass, he saw the room illuminated by a single dying candle. Silas Vane lay sleeping, his breath a wet, rattling sound, while on the escritoire sat the object of Kalen's hunt, a scroll bound in red silk and sealed with the Count's stolen signet. It was a forged death warrant for Alaric Thorne. Kalen slid the window latch with the jagged piece of glass he had kept hidden in his tunic. He slipped into the room, the scent of lavender and rot hitting him, the smell of Vane's misplaced vanity. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to cross the room and wrap his hands around the Inquisitor's throat, to end the man who had ordered the fire and the screams. But he saw Alaric's sapphire eyes in his mind, and he remembered the mission. Justice required the scroll. Vengeance could wait for the dawn. He moved across the floor like smoke, avoiding the creaking floorboards with an instinct born of 3 years of hiding. His hand closed over the red silk. The parchment felt hot against his palm, a physical manifestation of the lie that had already destroyed one family and was poised to devour another. Suddenly, Vane shifted in his sleep, his hand twitching toward the dagger on his nightstand. Kalen froze, his heart a frantic drum, his shadow cast long and jagged against the wall, a reflection of the beast he had pretended to be. He didn't breathe. He didn't move. He became the silence itself. Vane let out a low groan and settled back into a deep, alcohol-heavy slumber. Kalen tucked the scroll into his tunic and retreated to the window. As he stepped back out onto the ledge, he looked one last time at the sleeping monster. He didn't snarl. He didn't strike. He simply vanished into the night, the weight of the red silk a heavy promise against his chest. He was no longer just a mute survivor. He was a thief of truth, and for the first time in 3 years, he had a weapon that didn't require blood to draw. The morning air was thick with the smell of impending snow and wood smoke, but inside the great hall, the atmosphere was lethal. High Inquisitor Silas Vane stood by the hearth, his face a mask of purple vein fury. The red silk scroll was missing, and the theft had stripped away his veneer of religious piety. Search every room. Ransack the stables. Vane bellowed, his voice cracking like a whip over his cowering guards. Someone in this house has dared to rob the crown. Alaric stood at the center of the hall, his posture as rigid as the sword at his hip. You accuse my staff of theft, Silas? Perhaps you simply misplace your lies in the dark. Vane's eyes snapped to the doorway where Kalen stood, disguised in his mud-stained burlap, head bowed in his usual simpleton slouch. The Inquisitor stepped forward, his gaze raking over Kalen with sudden, horrifying clarity. He reached out not to strike, but to grab Kalen's hair, forcing his head back. He traced a line of Kalen's jaw, the Vance jaw, and the scar near his temple that had been earned on the night of the fire. "I know those eyes," Vane whispered, his voice trembling with a sick kind of triumph. "I watched them reflect the flames of Vance Manor. You aren't a mute, and you aren't a peasant. You are the shadow I've been hunting for 3 years." Vane turned to Alaric, a jagged smile twisting his lips. "Here is your thief, Count, and here is your treason. You have harbored the son of a traitor. By the king's law, your life is forfeit alongside his. Guards, seize them both." The clatter of steel filled the room as the Inquisitor's men drew their blades. Alaric didn't move. He looked at Kalen, truly looked at him, and then at the law he had spent his life defending. To protect Kalen was to become the very thing he hunted. To hand him over was to seal the death of the truth. "The law is a tool for justice, Silas," Alaric said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, resonant register. He stepped between Kalen and the advancing guards, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. "But you have turned it into a noose for the innocent. I choose the man over the mandate." Kalen felt the shattered shield of his ruse fall away completely. He reached into his tunic and pulled out the red silk scroll, holding it aloft. The room went still. He looked at Vane, no longer a beast, no longer mute, but a lord standing in the ruins of his own silence. The time for acting was over. The doors of the great hall groaned open as the king's royal guard, summoned by Alaric's earlier secret missive, marched into the chamber. Their armor reflected the cold morning light, and their presence shifted the room from a private execution to a public tribunal. Silas Vane stood frozen, his hand still outstretched toward the stolen scroll, his face a pale mask of desperate arrogance. "Arrest them!" Vane shrieked, pointing at Alaric and the dirt-stained boy beside him. "The Count harbors a fugitive. I have the proof of their conspiracy." Kalen stepped forward. The slouch was gone. The feral twitch of his shoulders had smoothed into the regal bearing of a man born to command. He didn't look at the blades leveled at his chest. He looked at the commander of the Royal Guard, a man who had once served alongside Kalen's father. For 3 years, Kalen's throat had been a tomb. Now he felt the vow of iron shatter. "The only conspiracy in this room, Commander, is the one written in the blood of my family," Kalen said. The sound of his voice, clear, aristocratic, and resonant, rippled to the hall like a physical shock. It was not the grunt of a stable hand, but the voice of a Vance. The guards faltered, their spears dipping in surprise. Alaric stood back, a shadow of a smile touching his lips as he watched the beast finally reclaim his humanity. Kalen unfurled the red silk scroll, his hand steady. This document, forged by Silas Vane's own hand, was intended to frame Count Thorne for the very crimes Vane himself committed. 3 years ago, he used this same ink to murder my father and brand me a traitor. I have been a mute and a savage to survive his shadow, but today the shadow ends. He tossed the scroll at the commander's feet. "I am Kalen Vance, son of the North. I have been a ghost in your stables and a witness to your corruption. I break my silence not for mercy, but for justice." Silas Vane lunged for his dagger, a final act of a cornered rat, but Alaric was faster. With a blur of steel, the Count disarmed the Inquisitor, pinning him against the cold hearth. "The bloodhound always finds a truth, Silas," Alaric whispered. "It just so happens this time, the truth has a voice of its own." The commander picked up the scroll, his eyes widening as he recognized the forged signatures. He looked at Kalen, seeing the boy who had survived the impossible. "Lord Vance," he said, bowing his head in a sign of recognition that ended Kalen's long exile. "The king will hear of this, and the Inquisitor will answer for every life he has stolen." As Vane was dragged away in irons, his screams echoing through the stone corridors, Kalen stood by the window, watching the sun rise over the moors. The silence was over. He was no longer invisible. He was no longer safe. But as Alaric stepped up beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder, Kalen realized that he finally had something worth speaking for. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It as crazy and more intriguing as you can ever image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.